The Great War, fought between 1914 and 1918, proved the prototype for the industrious wars that defined the 20th century. New weapons were introduced that led to new strategies and eventually new weapon systems as the evolution of violence stepped up a gear, with both sides trying to gain the upper hand over the other. As aircraft and submarines brought warfare to the skies and under the waves, back on the ground in the mud and the blood of the trenches, a new weapon emerged that would redefine land warfare: the tank. Introduced to combat on September 15, 1916, during the bloody and brutal Battle of the Somme, German infantry facing down these metal monsters trundling slowly and menacingly towards them must have felt like they had been hurtled into the pages of a pulp fiction science novel. After a mixed start, tanks were very quickly beginning to prove their worth, helping to break through enemy lines and fortifications that hitherto would have cost the lives of thousands of men to achieve the same results. By the end of the war, all of the major combatants had their own tank designs and concepts, while many others simply purchased variants of the groundbreaking British Mark I and Mark IV tanks. France and Germany had their own ideas, with the former designing the influential Renault FT-17 tank, which helped set the standard for tank designs to come, while the Germans developed what were akin to moving forts in the shape of the cumbersome A7V. Given the unprecedented horror of the Great War, in the post-war period there was a concerted effort to prevent such a catastrophe from happening again. As the losing party, Germany, now free of the Kaiser, had to accept guilt for starting the war, and as such, in the Treaty of Versailles, punishing restrictions were imposed on the country's armed forces, one of which being that it was forbidden from operating or developing tanks. Against this humiliation, the Nazi Party under Adolf Hitler was able to seize power on the promise of casting off the shackles of the restrictions placed upon the once powerful nation, and to restore Germany to its former glory. Breaking the treaty, Hitler began rebuilding Germany's armed forces, and this included new tank designs. Although contrary to the historical perspective today, tanks weren't as high a priority in the early years of the Nazi period as is generally believed. Hitler initially prioritized building up the Luftwaffe and the German Navy, and it wasn't until his tanks saw success in Poland and in France that he began to focus more on his army's armoured might. These armoured fighting vehicles would come to symbolize his conquest of Europe, North Africa and the Soviet Union, and while few ordinary people on the streets could identify them by sight, everyone knew these tanks by their name: the Panzers. In this episode we are going to examine the evolution of the Panzer series, from the humble Panzer I up to the excellent Panzer IV, before German armoured doctrine switched to newer, often heavier and more powerful tanks, which helped compensate for their increasing numerical inferiority in the face of the Allied armies. Welcome to Wars of the World. While it would be Hitler who would give Germany its armoured punch once again, it is often forgotten by history that in the years of the Weimar Republic, the period between the Kaiser's rule and the rise of the Nazis, German engineers circumvented the Treaty of Versailles by travelling to the Soviet Union, where they could clandestinely design new German tanks and test a handful of prototypes. This even extended to the operating of a tank school in Kazan for German soldiers. As payment for their cooperation, the Soviet Red Army received German expertise in tank design for them to apply in their own early vehicles. However, once Hitler came to power, it was ideologically unthinkable to continue working with the communist superpower. Finally abolishing the Treaty of Versailles, there was no longer any need for the agreement with the Soviet Union. But Hitler wasn't impressed with the designs the engineers brought back to Germany and demanded they apply what they had learned to a new design. At the time, there was some disagreement among the German high command as to how to proceed, with some, such as General Heinz Guderian, arguing for the development of a simple light tank to give Germany experience of developing and operating the new vehicles, lessons which could then be applied in newer, more capable tanks further down the line. This had the advantage of allowing German engineers to perfect their trade before Hitler committed to a major manufacturing order, but would leave the German army operating generally inferior tanks to their potential rivals. Others argued that German engineers should jump straight into a new medium-class tank to match the tanks operated by France and the Soviet Union. However, in the end, Guderian won the argument. As such, the first new German armoured fighting vehicle to enter mass production would be a light tank design, one which was not intended primarily for combat, but to instead lay the groundwork for manufacturing tanks in Nazi Germany, and to give the Wehrmacht what was essentially just a training tool. The resulting design that emerged borrowed heavily from the British Carden-Loyd tankette, weighing just 5.4 tons and possessing a mere 13mm of armour at its thickest, supporting an armament limited to just two 7.92mm MG-13 machine guns in the turret, weapons that were effectively useless against enemy armour. The crew complement was limited to just two, the driver in the hull and the commander who operated the guns in the turret. Aside from reconnaissance, internal security missions or an anti-infantry role, the tank was effectively useless. However, its main purpose was merely to kickstart Germany's new tank forces, and in that regard it succeeded, and every German tank that followed came as a result of this quaint little vehicle. Initially, the Germans were even reluctant to call them tanks, or even anything combat related, and so euphemistically described them as tractors. But by 1938, it was clear to all that Germany was rearming, and so they were redesignated Panzerkampfwagens, meaning armoured fighting vehicles. This being further shortened to Panzer, and the number 1 being assigned to these early vehicles. Production ran between 1934 and 1938, by which time 2,435 had been produced, the vast majority of them being built as light tanks, although command and dedicated training versions were also produced. Panzer Is were deployed to fight in Spain alongside the nationalist forces, where they encountered superior Soviet-manufactured T-26s. This prompted the fitting of additional armour and a Breda 20mm cannon that in ideal conditions could penetrate up to 40mm of armour. Panzer Is also fought in the Chinese army against the Japanese, prior to the strengthening of ties between Berlin and Tokyo. Panzer I served in a variety of roles for the Germans throughout the Second World War, but were quickly becoming obsolete, except in the most rudimentary of combat arenas. Many spent the final days of the war towing supplies or broken down vehicles, ironically making them as they had once been described as little more than tractors. With the Panzer I in service, by 1936 Hitler was keen to start producing medium and heavy tanks, but both of these projects were delayed, and so as a stopgap it was decided to develop the Panzer I's lethality and protection. The resulting Panzer II took inspiration from the Panzer I but was larger at 8.9 tons, and supported heavier armament from the outset, in the form of one of the MG-13s being replaced by a 20mm KWK-30 L55 autocannon, which was devastating to most contemporary light and even some medium tanks then in service. The increase in size and firepower saw the crew increase to 3, comprising of a driver, a commander who operated the main armament, and a loader. Despite the increased weight, the more powerful Maybach HL62 TRM 6-cylinder 138 horsepower petrol engine meant that it was just as fast as its smaller predecessor. However, the armour, at least in the initial variants, was only fractionally improved. But following combat experience, Panzer IIs would feature even greater armoured protection, often crudely bolted onto the sides. 1,856 examples would be built, standing in as the premier German tank until the first medium designs appeared. Like the Panzer I, the Panzer II was quickly rendered obsolete by newer allied types and anti-armour weapons, forcing them to be increasingly used in second-line roles or against airborne troops. However, the Panzer II's greatest contribution to the German war effort was to provide the chassis for a number of far more successful vehicles, particularly in the area of self-propelled guns, bringing heavy firepower to the battlefield. As production of the Panzer I began, German engineers and tacticians were getting ready to take the next step, which would see the Wehrmacht fielding a tank capable of matching those it would likely face in combat. The origins of what would become the Panzer III began in a meeting of the German General Staff on January 11, 1934, which outlined the requirements for a medium tank, chiefly of which would be its use in engaging enemy armour and thus denying the enemy this advantage. Originally, Hitler wanted the tank to be armed with a 50mm gun, an awesomely powerful weapon for a 1934 design. But this wasn't ready for service, and so the German 37mm gun was adopted for the time being. The final design chosen for production was based on the chassis originating from the Daimler-Benz proposal. The A variant of the Panzer I, weighed in at 15 tons, was armed with a 37mm KWK 36 L46.5 main gun and two 7.92mm MG34 machine guns. The tank had a crew of 5, a commander, a gunner, a loader, a driver, and a radio operator, who also fired the bow machine gun, and they were protected by up to 15 centimeters of rolled homogeneous armor. Power was provided by a water-cooled Maybach HL108 TR engine, which produced 250 horsepower at 2,800 RPM, and propelled the new tank up to 35 km per hour or 21 miles per hour. While a major step up in performance for the Wehrmacht, the first prototype Panzer IIIs had barely come off the assembly line when it was realized they were already obsolete, particularly when considering the levels of protection needed in the Spanish Civil War. Thus, only 8 A variants were built, primarily to serve as test beds for improved models. Between 1937 and 1939, 3 more variants would be produced in limited numbers, each offering improvements in suspension and armor protection, which had been doubled by the invasion of Poland to 30mm, requiring more powerful engines to compensate for the extra weight. Then there was the F variant. The tank finally got its 50mm gun in the form of the KWK 38 L42, giving it an effective punch against Allied tanks of the day. And this would be the first mass-produced variant, with 450 examples built between 1939 and 1940. In combat in Poland and France, the 37mm and 50mm armed tanks performed well, even when facing enemy tanks that were a match. The biggest problem the Germans faced was that they initially didn't have enough of these tanks, and had to rely on the earlier Panzer Is and IIs, as well as their superior tactics, including close operation with aircraft to win the day. By the time they reached the deserts of North Africa, the tank's shortcomings were appearing against heavier British armour, such as the Matilda II, and US-supplied Grant tanks, equipped with a powerful 75mm gun, which could outrange the Panzer IIIs. Only worse was to come in the invasion of the Soviet Union, where the Panzer IIIs were almost rendered ineffective against the T-34s and the KV series heavy tanks. This forced the Germans to introduce a crash program to arm the Panzer III with more powerful KWK 39 L60 main guns, producing the J variant, which also featured more armor, it now being in the region of 50mm at its thickest. The J variant would go on to be the most numerous, with 1,521 being built, followed closely by the L variant, of which 1,470 were built, and featured 20mm standoff armor plates on both the hull and the turret front, as well as a novel system for transferring heated engine coolant to another vehicle. However, despite these improvements, by 1942 the tank was reaching the end of its deployment life, and was increasingly vulnerable to newer Allied designs. These therefore became relegated to a fire support role, armed with a short-barrel 75mm gun, before being superseded by the Panzer IV and the heavier Tiger and Panther tanks. The Panzer III would serve out the last days of the war, relegated to training duties, and supporting German logistics efforts by towing supplies to the front line. Like the Panzer II, its chassis would be used as the basis for a number of other vehicles, such as the highly successful Sturmgeschütz III assault gun, while Japan had examined 2 examples with the intention of reverse engineering them, but this failed to produce any vehicles. Through the conception of the Panzer III tank, Guderian recognized that panzer battalions would benefit from having a smaller number of heavier and more powerful tanks operating in a dedicated support company. Ideally, a battalion would consist of 3 companies of Panzer IIIs and a single company of the newer, heavier tank. This new tank's role would primarily focus on clearing out enemy fortifications and engaging mobile or static anti-tank guns, many of which outgunned the weapons fitted to most tanks in service in the mid-1930s. The DNA of what would become the Panzer IV can be traced back to a 1934 specification that again identified the new vehicle as a medium tractor. Guderian envisioned the fours being in the region of 24 tons and armed with a powerful 75mm howitzer-type main gun. The usual German manufacturers put forth proposals to meet the requirement, but it was Krupp's vehicle which ultimately won the contract to be developed into a front-line vehicle. Krupp would put forward two designs to meet the requirement. The first a 17.2-ton vehicle, which was followed by a heavier 18.5-ton vehicle, the latter of which featuring the same armament and configuration, but featuring heavier armor. At the time, there was something of a flirtation amongst tank designing nations with the concept of multi-turreted tanks. Britain and Russia especially invested in research into such armoured fighting vehicles, with a handful even making it into service before it was realised the concept was fatally flawed, as the extra turrets only added weight while decreasing overall protection. All this without offering any significant advantage. Nevertheless, an option was included for a second turret on the forward hull of the larger of Krupp's proposals. Mounted twin machine guns was included in the proposal, although quite rightly this doesn't appear to have gone beyond the design phase. Krupp manufactured two prototypes, one of which came with 6 road wheels, while another featured 8, in order to test which configuration produced the best gun platform. In the end, the 8-wheel configuration was seen as the best option, and along with a number of other improvements, this vehicle served as the basis for the initial production batch of Panzer IVs. These entering service in 1936, although only 35 of the A variant would be manufactured before an improved B variant was produced. The Panzer IV A variant weighed in at 18 tons and was divided into 4 compartments: an enclosed driving compartment at the front, the forward mounting transmission, the central crew compartments, and the engine compartment at the rear. The engine and the crew compartments were separated by a fire-resistant and gas-tight armoured firewall. To power the new tank, Maybach, producing the water-cooled HL-108TR, which produced 230 horsepower at 2,600 RPM and linked to a 5-speed transmission. The Panzer IV had a fairly large crew for vehicles of the time, comprising of 5 men, which included the commander, gunner, loader, driver, and finally the radio operator, who sat in the hull with the driver, and who also operated the hull-mounted machine gun. The main armament consisted of a single short-barreled 75mm KWK 37L24 gun. The weapon featured a semi-automatic breech, which meant that after firing, the spent cartridge would be self-ejected, which greatly increased the overall firing rate. With a muzzle velocity of 325 meters per second, the gun was initially armed with high explosive or smoke rounds for destroying unarmored targets, such as anti-tank gun emplacements. But an armor-piercing shell was also designed when it was realized the Panzer IV would likely have to mix in with enemy tanks, this shell being able to penetrate 38mm of armor at 500 meters range. Despite the envisioned role of attacking fortified positions, armor protection for the initial Panzer IVA model was fairly weak, being just 16mm of nickel-free homogeneous and rolled plates at its thickest. Around the time the Panzer IV was entering service, the British Army was in the final stages of introducing the Boy's anti-tank rifle, which could theoretically penetrate the armor of the A variant at 100 meters. Therefore, one of the first major improvements fitted to the new tank was an additional 14mm of frontal armor, greatly increasing protection. Although even this would quickly prove inefficient, and another 30mm would be added to surviving A variants by 1941, bringing the total to 60mm of armor. After the initial 35 vehicles, production switched to the B variant, which, as well as incorporating the additional armor, saw the fitting of a more powerful Maybach engine, coupled to a new transmission with 6 forward gears and 1 reverse, which increased top speed to 26.1 miles per hour. As experience grew, additional quality of life improvements were incorporated, resulting in the C variant, which had an improved commander's cupola and improved protection. Protection was again increased in the D variant, particularly on the sides, which was nearly doubled to 20mm. By the invasion of Poland, 211 Panzer IVs were available to the Wehrmacht's armoured units and proved highly successful in their envisioned role of clearing out fortified positions. After the fall of Poland, Hitler ordered production of the Panzer IV to be ramped up to face the armoured might of Britain and France. But crews continued to have difficulty penetrating the armour of several Allied tank types, both in France and later in North Africa. This fact, coupled with the expected large-scale tank battles in the impending invasion of the Soviet Union, meant that in May 1941, Hitler authorized the F variant into production. This was the heaviest variant so far, weighing in excess of 22 tons, as it incorporated better designed armor based on the modifications already made to existing vehicles. But noticeably, the distinct short-barreled gun was replaced by a longer-barreled 50mm PaK 38 L60. However, combat with Soviet KV series heavy tanks, and then the legendary T-34 medium tanks, proved that even this was insufficient, and so Krupp began work to incorporate the 75mm PaK 40 gun. In order to work within the confines of the Panzer IV, the weapon was reworked into the KWK-40 L34, and in trials this had around 74% greater penetrative power than the original KWK-37 L24. By 1944, despite efforts to further improve the Panzer IV, it was becoming obvious that the tank was reaching the limits of its design, but it remained a competent tank to continue in production. By this time, heavy bombing of German infrastructure by Allied air forces was seriously hampering tank production, and so the J variant was a significantly simplified version, with the hope this would ease the burden on German industry. By the time production had stopped, the many variants of the Panzer IV numbered 8,553 tanks, making it the second most numerous armoured fighting vehicle produced by Germany after the Stug III. The tank also served as the basis for a number of specialised vehicles, while captured examples were pressed into service in the post-war French army as they waited for the arrival of new French tanks. Many of these Panzer IVs were then sold to Syria and incredibly served long enough to participate nominally in the 1967 Six-Day War and later in the 1973 Yom Kippur War, both of these against Israel. After the Panzer IV entered service, work began on an even larger tank in the 30+ ton range. The fruits of this work saw the introduction of the Tiger I, considered one of the most fearsome tanks in history, despite a number of shortcomings. This was followed by the Panther tank, considered one of the best medium tanks of the entire war. Originally, the Panther was to be designated as the Panzer V, but at Hitler's insistence, this was dropped to imply a new design line had begun. Both these tanks and the heavy tanks that followed them in Germany's dying days have largely overshadowed the story of the Panzer I to the Panzer IV. Their stellar performance, compared to most of their contemporaries, only serves to highlight the Panzer's shortcomings and often mediocre performance. German tactics and close cooperation with infantry, air and artillery allowed them to achieve much of their success that they did. However, they still gave Germany an armoured punch in the early stages of the war and helped define the concept of the blitzkrieg style of warfare. They also laid the groundwork for the tanks that followed, and thanks to the works of the propagandists of the day, their name Panzer became synonymous with German armour during the war.